Dearly beloved, today we mark the 19th Sunday after Pentecost, and the gospel, although it's probably familiar to us in its broad strokes, should disturb us or make us think about its details. The key point of the parable is that salvation is not to be taken for granted. When God invites us to his eternal banquet, we should respond promptly and also prepare ourselves accordingly. The general outline of the parable is clear enough. There are invitations that are made and some refused, with either indifference or some even with violence. Others accept the invitation, but some give due attention and others just wander in on the street. Although we may think of ourselves as the folks in the banquet at the end, there is also a spiritual sense in which each time here it applies to us as individuals. The way that all these things fit together is through the virtue of charity. St. Gregory the Great identifies the garment that the man is not wearing at the end as being that virtue. But it is not only about the man at the end. Each person who denied the invitation or did not respond properly was lacking charity, but each in a different way. The one through negligence, the one through malice, and the one through lack of good works. Charity is a word that is somewhat misused in our culture, at least from the point of view of the church and her theology. It is defined by the virtue by which we love God for his own sake. It's opposed to faith and hope in the sense that faith, as we believe in God, as revealing to us the truths of our faith. Hope is leaning on God to acquire salvation. And charity is to love God not for what he can give us, but to love him for his own sake, as he is. The virtue of hope, for instance, is loving God, but in relation to what he can give to us, which is salvation. Hope is a good virtue, especially for these days, that no matter what happens to us, we still believe that God will make good on his promises to save us. But charity is greater. As Paul says, charity never fails. It never goes away. Charity is the virtue that caused Job to say amid his many trials, although God would kill me, I would still trust in him. Charity moves us to do things for God even if he doesn't reward us for them. It is the highest virtue because it seeks no recompense. It desires only that God be known and that God be loved. Of the three types of men in the parable, all of them lack charity. The first type are those who politely refuse the invitation. They lack charity or love of God because they are more concerned with their own projects than with serving God. As St. Gregory says, one person is concerned with earthly toil, another devoted to the activity of this world. They take no notice of the mystery of the Lord's incarnation and are unwilling to live in accordance with it. This applies to us in the sense that each of us has to earn our daily bread by the sweat of our brow. And that means all the daily irritations that come from managing a household and paying bills. But if we are so involved in our livelihoods that we don't have time for God, it could be that we are neglecting the Lord and refusing his invitation. The most common way that each of us does this is by putting off prayer for something that has to be done right now, or praying with little attention, thinking about other things when we pray. We can also have too much unnecessary concern about making money or increasing our social status. It is possible to be a good man and to still be very worldly, and the worldly man lacks charity. He is at best lukewarm. The second type of man in the parable is the one who not only refuses the invitation, but actually roughs up the messenger. Sometimes the invitations that God makes to us, the call to prayer or to deeper conversion, don't come through a gentle breeze, but they come through an earthquake. Someone, sometimes it's God, sometimes it's one of our fellows, reminds us that we are not as holy as we think we are. And instead of acknowledging the truth, we are offended by what that person says. We might even lash out at them, even if it is God in our conscience. When we are corrected, insulted, or accused, our best first response is always silence. That way we avoid further conflict in the moment because we shut our mouths and don't say something we would regret. And then later we humbly consider what has been said to us and whether there is really any truth in it. Oftentimes there is truth in rebukes. It's just the case that, generally speaking, we overdo it with rebukes. We add too many other things when we could have corrected the one thing we were actually upset about. Now, this consideration and silence of rebukes goes both ways. If we like to give out rebukes, which some personalities do, we should also be willing to take them, especially from inferiors, or even from inferiors. But rebukes are always to be given with love and the desire for upholding or upbuilding the other person. Otherwise, they lack charity, even if we get what we want to get through the benediction. The third type of man is the one who accepted the invitation and entered the banquet, but he did not take the garment offered at the door. What this parable does not demonstrate is the arbitrary nature of God, which is easy to take from it. That is to say that there was a garment, but it was hidden away. This man didn't know where it was. And then when God walked in, he said, "Why aren't you wearing the garment that I provided? It was in the closet over there that was locked." That's not the way that this parable is to be read. Rather, it's like the dreams, which I have, and maybe you have also, where you go in to take an exam and you find that you're somewhat poorly clothed. You only have on your underwear. Now, you know that you shouldn't have gone to the exam only wearing underwear. You knew that that was not appropriate. So when the professor comes up and says, "You should have put on more clothing, leave," you know that you have nothing to say. That's what it's like in this parable. There were garments given out as everyone entered this place of assembly. They were given out by priests or by his friends, by his guardian angel in reminding him of things, by his patron saints, by anyone who wished his salvation. They all offered it a garment as he came in. But he refused every offer. He said, "No, thank you, I'll wait until later, or maybe next time." Or maybe he put it on and then set it off because it was burdensome to him. Notice that in the end, his responses end up being a lot like the first type of man who refused the invitation altogether. It's just that this third type of man had faith. He believed in the doctrines of God. Maybe he could even explain them to others. But he did nothing or very few things out of love of God. He expected others to do that sort of thing, like priests and nuns and pious people. Or perhaps he thought that in order to love God, one has to do great things, rather than simply doing everyday things with very much love. And so he did no good works in his lifetime. He somehow thought, despite the teaching of Christ and of St. Paul, the examples and exhortations of the saints, that he didn't need to do anything, that faith was sufficient. But in his heart he knew better, and that's why he had nothing to say. He knew that his love was weak and his heart was cold. He was like a man who was freezing to death with a fire a few feet away from him, but he would not approach the fire because it might make him hot. He might have to change his life. Notice again that the man at the end does not protest what the king says when he walks through. He knows that what he has said is just. He had faith in the Lord Jesus, in his death and his resurrection, in heaven and hell and the final judgment. But he set charity aside, love of God. And now the time has come to answer for that. There are two things here to motivate us in terms of growing in charity. The one is, which I recommend less, fear. Fear that this might actually happen to you at the end of your life. That you'll walk into heaven and you'll be thrown out because you didn't have the garment with you. There's another example which is more to the point, the example of the saints. Even though we know that the saints had great charity, love of God, and love of neighbor, they always assumed that they did not really have love of God. And so by always striving to love God more, they protected themselves against negligence and against putting aside things until the last moment. They assumed that they did not do enough for God, and therefore they did very much. What are three practical ways we can grow in charity? First of all, since it's a divine virtue, we should ask God to increase it in our hearts. If we feel like we are lukewarm, one of the solutions is to ask God to make us hot. Ask him to do that, especially when you receive the Blessed Sacrament at Mass, because it's Christ himself, it is God. If anyone can warm your heart, it's God himself. Ask him to do that when you receive him today. And if you find that you are cold, then receive more often. Come to Mass during the weeks, if you can, during the weekdays. Another way to grow in love is to read about the Lord in the Scriptures and in the lives of the saints. It is a common dictum that in order to love something, we have to know it. So that means we have to put work into knowing someone. A third way to grow in charity is to make sacrifices for sinners, to offer things for people you wish you could draw closer to God, but you can't by the things you say or the things you do. So instead you suffer in silence for them. This is very simple. It's something that Our Lady of Fatima told the little children when she appeared to them, because all of us can do it. All of us has daily contradictions which we would rather were gone. And sometimes we have more significant contradictions that happen and we have no idea where they come from. But they can be allowed by God so that we can use them as a means for someone else's salvation. We are certain to grow in charity if instead of complaining about the things that bother us and irritate us and weigh us down, that we offer them for someone else whom we would like to know and love God as we do. Now, by doing these things faithfully and by thinking about them carefully and prayerfully when you go home, our hearts will grow in love and warmth. We should again hope that God will increase our charity, trust Him that He will. And charity is always a sweet reward for our labors, because it is the assurance that we have actually served God in the depth of our heart, and that we can rest secure in that even if we are completely troubled in every other aspect of our life. Charity is the thing that always consoles us and is never not worth investing in. May the Mother of God, whose commemoration I forgot to make at the beginning, help us with these things. She, above all, knew all these things in the depth of her heart, and she knew how to love God above all things and to sacrifice her entire life to make that possible for us also. Today we celebrate in commemoration her motherhood, her maternity. So let us each turn to her in our hearts and ask her to help us in these things. She is still our mother. She still intercedes for us. She holds us in the fold of her arms as she leads us to eternity. So cry out to her today especially that you may grow in this holiest of virtues, which is charity. And I assure you that that love of God will strengthen you for whatever is to come in this world, no matter what it may be. May the Lord console each of you, especially through receiving Him today in Blessed Communion, that you may know Him in the depths of your hearts and also His love for you. Please rise for the creed.